One seemingly ordinary morning, the world was once again thrown into chaos by a tweet from Donald Trump, the newly elected president who hadn't even set foot in the White House yet, but had already stirred up a storm. He announced a 25% tariff on all imported goods from Canada. At first glance, it seemed like a spur-of-the-moment decision, but in reality, it was a razor-sharp strike aimed straight at the economy of America's northern neighbor. And among the industries affected, surprisingly, was lobster. That bright red crustacean, long associated with lavish feasts, had suddenly become a weapon in a trade war. Many people might laugh, even find it hard to believe. How could a seafood item cause such a stir? But if you look closer, you'll see that lobster is far more than just a dish. It's the lifeblood of coastal communities in Maine, USA, and Nova Scotia, Canada. It's a symbol of tradition, of hard work, of pride. And in a globalized world where every number can be turned into a political card, even a lobster can tip the scales of power. In that moment, people suddenly realized the fishing nets cast out into the ocean don't just haul in seafood, they carry with them the fate of nations. When a diner in Paris picks up their knife and fork to savor a lobster, behind that single bite lies an entire chain of connections, from trade agreements and tariff policies to clever diplomatic campaigns. And it's precisely in a place that seems so far removed from the sea, the international negotiation table, where the destiny of fishermen in Maine or Nova Scotia is truly decided. To see this more clearly, just look at Europe, a gourmet market once considered the gold mine for American fishermen. Yet with a single agreement signed by Ottawa, the entire playing field shifted, turning Canada from a runner-up into a front-runner. And from that point on, the story of Canada winning through diplomacy, America falling behind in Europe, began to unfold, revealing the true power of the fine print in an agreement, even more than the power of sails on the open sea. In 2017, while Americans were still busy arguing over slogans like "Make America Great Again," north of the border, Ottawa quietly signed a landmark deal, the CETA agreement with the European Union. With a single signature, the tariff barrier on Canadian lobster vanished overnight. Meanwhile, the US, long confident in the reputation and quality of its Maine lobster, suddenly found itself at a disadvantage. An 8% tariff still remained. That number may sound small, but for a restaurant in Paris, Berlin, or Rome importing several tons of seafood each month, that 8% was a deep cut, tens of thousands of dollars lost. And so on the menus of high-end restaurants, the name Maine lobster gradually gave way to Canadian lobster. A quiet but bitter shift. From Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, cold containers packed with lobster crossed the Atlantic in steady waves, bringing surging profits to Canada's coastal communities. Fishermen called it a gift from Ottawa's negotiation table, a rare diplomatic victory that translated instantly into everyday gains. Meanwhile, in Maine, lifelong fishermen who had devoted their lives to the sea were left with a painful truth. They hadn't lost on quality, they'd lost on politics. The sharp edge of tariffs and trade agreements had pushed them to the sidelines, their hard-earned sweat swallowed by the unfair rules of a global game. But this story goes beyond profit. It drives home a hard lesson. In today's world, sometimes a dinner table in Europe holds more power than a fishing net cast into the ocean. From Paris to Brussels, Milan to Copenhagen, the words Canadian lobster appeared with growing frequency, a quiet, unofficial declaration that the US had lost its edge in a game it once dominated. And as Maine's fishermen looked wistfully across the Atlantic, they came to realize just how steep the price of delay in trade negotiations could be. If Europe was the first board on which Canada claimed victory, it was only the beginning, because Ottawa didn't stop with CETA. They extended their diplomatic reach further, stepping into an even bigger and more promising arena, the CPTPP agreement. And as new doors began to open across Asia, yet another juicy prize fell squarely into Canada's lap, while the US found itself pushed further and further away from the table it once dreamed of sitting at the head of. After the momentum of CETA in Europe, Canada didn't stop. Ottawa understood that global trade is like a vast ocean. Those who know where to cast their nets will get their share. So they quickly doubled down on another major agreement, the CPTPP, a sweeping free trade pact spanning the Asia-Pacific region. And once again, the US stood on the sidelines. As Washington withdrew, Canada quietly moved forward, stepping into the massive void left behind, a void they were more than ready to fill. Markets once considered gold mines in the East, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, all flung their doors wide open for Canadian lobster. In Tokyo, where live lobster is seen as a luxury dish for upscale weddings, seafood containers from Halifax began taking over shelves. In Singapore, high-end restaurants promoted menus boasting Canadian lobster fresh from the Atlantic, turning the crustacean into a symbol of elegance and premium quality. In Hanoi and Saigon, trendy wedding banquets also began to feature Canadian lobster more and more frequently, as if it were the natural choice. Meanwhile, Maine's fishermen continued to fall behind, not because they lacked quality, but because tariffs had made American lobster significantly more expensive. Asian consumers, highly sensitive to price and swayed by marketing buzzwords like sustainable and clean, which Ottawa hammered home in campaign after campaign, began leaning toward Canada. It didn't take long before Canada dominated the market. In 2023, China, the world's largest importer of lobster, spent nearly $790 million on the crustacean, and 3/4 of that came from Canada. Even though the US posted an impressive 86% growth in exports, it still managed to capture only a quarter of the pie. On billboards across Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou, the slogan "Canadian lobster, fresh and sustainable" lit up in bold letters. It wasn't just advertising, it was a statement. Canada had earned Asia's trust. And when a Chinese diner lifted a piece of lobster in a luxury restaurant, it wasn't just a matter of taste. It was the result of smart diplomacy and Washington's delay. But history never moves in a straight line. Just as Canada was relishing its juicy prize in Asia, undercurrents began to stir. Because heading into 2025, the global chessboard shifted once again. Donald Trump returned, bringing back his trademark hardline tariffs, and Beijing wasn't about to sit still. A sudden shockwave hit, and the Canadian lobster industry, once gliding smoothly through an ocean of profits, found itself bracing for a violent storm named retaliatory tariffs. In March 2025, Donald Trump followed through on a major campaign promise. He imposed a 25% tariff on all goods imported from Canada. The decision sent shockwaves through American and Canadian media alike. Many assumed that Maine's lobster industry would get swept up in the chaos, but then a surprising detail emerged. Seafood was excluded from the tariff list. The reason was crystal clear. Maine is a key swing state, and lobster represents livelihoods. Trump might have been tough on Canada, but he wasn't about to shoot himself in the foot. Canada didn't stay quiet either. Ottawa retaliated by slapping tariffs on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, but they too spared seafood. Both sides understood that lobster had grown beyond the scope of trade. It had become a domestic political landmine, a ticking time bomb that could explode within the electorate at any moment. So both Washington and Ottawa left a buffer zone, a deliberate choice to keep their hands off the lobster. But then, the real surprise came from Beijing. China, a market that absorbed nearly half of Canada's seafood exports, announced a 25% tariff on 49 US and Canadian products, including lobster. It was a gut punch aimed straight at one of Ottawa's soft spots. In 2024 alone, Canada had exported about $1.8 billion worth of seafood to China, nearly half of which was lobster. Overnight, the golden route to Asia's largest market was blocked. Fishermen in Nova Scotia, who had been riding high on a wave of non-stop contracts, now found themselves stunned and anxious at the sight of lobster piling up in cold storage with nowhere to go. Meanwhile, Washington watched from the sidelines with a touch of smug satisfaction. As China turned its back on Canada, the door began to crack open again for Maine lobster. But a looming question hung in the air. Is this a lasting opportunity, or just a fleeting illusion? Because in global trade, even a small change in tariffs can redirect the entire flow of the market in the blink of an eye. And if the US thinks it can easily reclaim its former edge, it may be mistaken. The next moves won't be played only on the chessboard of tariffs, but on a new battlefield, where politics wears the mask of environmentalism, and humpback whales and North Atlantic right whales become pawns in a game of cold, calculated strategy. Tariffs were only the beginning. The lobster war soon opened up a new front, the environment. In August 2025, Washington officially activated the Marine Mammal Protection Act, with a new clause that sent shockwaves through the global seafood industry. Starting in 2026, the U.S. would ban imports of seafood from any country that cannot prove it protects North Atlantic right whales and humpback whales from the threat of entanglement in fishing gear. The arrow was aimed squarely at Canada, where many fishermen still rely on traditional trap ropes, gear that can inflict fatal injuries on these massive endangered creatures. Nova Scotia's fishermen were outraged. They saw it as nothing more than a disguised trade barrier, set up to push Canadian lobster out of the U.S. market. On the docks, men who were once calm now shouted in frustration, "We're not killing whales, we're just trying to make a living from the sea." Ottawa pushed back forcefully, accusing the law of being discriminatory, pointing out that the U.S. fishing industry hadn't completely solved its own whale entanglement problem either. But Washington stood firm, insisting the rule wasn't targeting Canada alone. It would apply to over 40 countries. "We're simply protecting the environment and marine resources," they declared. Yet everyone knew that beneath the righteous language lay a sharp and calculated political move. In an era where environmentalism has become a core value, whoever gets to define sustainable holds the key to opening or closing global markets. And so, from now on, lobster will not only have to weather trade storms, but also navigate a gauntlet of strict environmental standards. The tragedy is that the people most affected by these seemingly noble rules are the very communities who've lived in harmony with the sea for generations, people whose survival depends on every haul of the net. In Maine and Nova Scotia, where wooden boats and red buoys still bob along the water, the new law has cast another shadow of uncertainty. Amid the waves of politics, trade, and environmental regulation, their lives have veered down a rugged path, one where hardship and hope intertwine. And it is in these coastal communities that we see most clearly the true face of the lobster war. In Maine, lobster isn't just a source of income, it's a core part of identity, a deep-rooted pride passed down through generations. From Bar Harbor to Rockland, the sight of small wooden boats surrounded by hundreds of red, orange, and white buoys glittering on the water has become iconic. Every morning, fishermen head out to sea, dropping traps and hauling cages, not just as a job, but as a sacred ritual that binds them to the ocean. But when the European market collapsed, when Asia leaned toward Canada, and when whale protection laws began looming overhead, those time-honored traditions suddenly unraveled. Families lost their livelihoods, children were forced to leave home in search of other work. During campaign rallies, the image of angry Maine fishermen holding up signs that read, "Save our lobster," became a political symbol. And lobster was no longer just in the boiling pot, but at the heart of heated debates in the halls of Congress. Across the border, Nova Scotia had once basked in its golden days. Trade deals with Europe, China, and Japan brought in massive profits. The ports of Halifax bustled with activity, cold storage facilities ran at full capacity, and people spoke eagerly of a bright future. But then came the cold slap from Beijing. When China imposed tariffs, exports backed up, and smiles quickly gave way to concern. The fishermen of Nova Scotia, once proud of their country's diplomatic strength, suddenly found themselves in the same precarious position as their neighbors in Maine. Tragedy and hope now flowed in parallel currents. On one side, the fear of being drowned. On the other, the burning desire to find a way out and keep surviving. And in both communities, one question echoed again and again: who will save us? For now, the answer came in the form of emergency relief, hastily rolled out support packages from both Washington and Ottawa meant to soothe the anger swelling along the docks. But everyone knew those subsidies were just temporary oxygen tanks in the midst of a deeper crisis, because the root of the problem wasn't in the sea. It was at the negotiation tables, in politics and diplomacy. And from here, we step into a new chapter, one where relief packages, political decisions, and international agreements become chess pieces in a global game more complex than ever before. To calm the rising tide of outrage along the coasts, both Washington and Ottawa were forced to act. The U.S. swiftly announced support packages worth hundreds of millions of dollars, not only to compensate for the lost income of Maine's fishermen, but also to fund research into whale-safe fishing gear, invest in modern preservation technology, and sustain the struggling coastal communities being pushed to the brink. Canada wasn't far behind. Ottawa launched emergency relief funds, promised retraining programs for fishermen, sought to expand into new markets in the Middle East and South America, and ramped up its campaign to brand Canadian lobster as a global symbol of sustainability and premium quality. But both sides understood clearly, these subsidies were little more than short-term oxygen tanks in a deep sea dive. They might help people breathe for a while, but they couldn't change the current. The root of the issue wasn't about how many lobsters could be caught or how high the quality was. It was about trade agreements, about how a nation chooses to position itself within the rules of the global game. Canada had already proven this by skillfully inserting itself into agreements like CETA and CPTPP, unlocking doors that the US had let close. While Washington wrestled with protectionism and tariff walls, Ottawa had moved one step ahead, turning diplomacy into a strategic fishing rod and reeling in benefits that far outweighed the value of any single lobster. This story reflects a sobering truth. In the 21st century, it's not always the most powerful nations that win, but those that know how to play by the rules, build trust through agreements and partnerships. A smaller country with a more modest economy can still leave a superpower scrambling simply by playing its diplomatic cards wisely. And that's what makes the lobster war more than just a trade dispute. It becomes a vivid testament to a shifting world order where every agreement, every signature has the power to determine not just the fate of a fishing industry, but the image of a nation on the global stage. Looking back on the entire journey, one thing becomes clear. The lobster itself has never changed, but the world around it has shifted dramatically. From CETA flinging open the doors to Europe, to CPTPP spanning the Pacific, from Washington's hardline tariffs to Beijing's sudden counterpunch, and even the moral veneer of environmental legislation, all of it turned the humble lobster into a pawn on the geopolitical chessboard. A fine dinner in Paris, Tokyo, or Shanghai, where a diner lifts a piece of Canadian lobster to their lips, that's no longer just a culinary experience, but a symbol of the power of negotiation and diplomacy. Meanwhile, Maine's fishermen, diligent and proud, have watched their traditional markets slip away, only to realize that in the battleground of 21st century commerce, sweat and hard work are no longer enough. Today's world is ruled by agreements, by regulations, and by political trust. For Canada, even its current victory remains fragile under the looming threat of Chinese retaliation and the renewed pressure from Washington. For the US, the bigger question remains unanswered. Will they adapt their strategy or continue to watch their legacy industries be pushed to the margins? What do you think about this lobster war? Is it just a trade dispute or a symbol of shifting global power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next deep dive into the world of geopolitics.